Hello and welcome to this second video on leadership and well-being, brought to you by the Education Broker. My name is James Hilton. I come from Derby. It's been a strange start to the academic year in lots of places, but particularly here in Derby. This was the back to school aisle in our local supermarket at the beginning of the year. Not entirely sure who the target audience was here, but I strongly suspect it was education professionals working in schools. So I spent 26 years in teaching, 23 years in senior leadership roles, and I was a head for 15 years, latterly of a school that grew from 150 on roll to around 800 on roll within the space of 10 to 12 years. But these days I make my living as a speaker and as an author. And I've written 3 books now on leadership and the well-being of staff in the schools. So that's my background. And in this particular video, I want to concentrate today on leadership and optimism. And optimism is something that I think at times we've probably all struggled with at some point in this year. But yet I think it is one of the most important traits a school leader can have, because optimism gives us the ability to see beyond our current situation to a time when things might be better. And if we can keep that vision in our mind, then it becomes easier, whether it's COVID or some other challenge, to begin to plot a course of action of how we move from here to there. So it's hugely important, if sometimes challenging. Now, I think in our heart of hearts, most of us would like to be considered as an optimist. When I think of optimists, I tend to think of people who are confident and gregarious and popular. Whereas when I think of pessimists, I tend to think of people who are sometimes the harbingers of doom, the members of staff who may plod along the corridor with the demeanour of Eeyore and are well worth taking a quick diversion into the store cupboard to avoid. I jest, but we all know the kind of personality perhaps that I'm talking about. You see, optimists tend to look on the favourable side of life. They tend to expect favourable outcomes to situations. They anticipate that, maybe not in the short term, but in the medium and in the long term. So when we think of optimists, we often associate optimism with words like cheerfulness, hopefulness, and confidence. And I guess we all feel like that sometimes, but sometimes perhaps we'd like to feel like that a bit more of the time than we currently do. Dr. Wayne Dyer, a motivational speaker, once said, if we believe things will work out, we will see opportunities. If we think they won't, then we tend to see obstacles. And I think there's a lot in there. Optimistic leaders, you see, I think face exactly the same problems and dilemmas and setbacks as everybody else, but they see them as something to be overcome, a challenge even. And sometimes, depending on the situation, they may even get something of a kick out of beating the odds, sense of satisfaction. They will have, optimists, exactly the same setbacks and failures and knockbacks as everybody else, but they tend to see them as transient states. It's not a permanent situation. Whereas pessimists, now, I'm not painting them as bad people, they're not at all, but they tend to be characterized by what we sometimes refer to as the 4 Ps. The first P is permanence. They tend to see a negative situation as something that is unlikely to go away. Therefore, they find it harder to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So if they do experience knockbacks, it's not necessarily that they won't overcome them, but sometimes it will take them that bit longer. So P is for permanence. It's also for pervasiveness. And pervasiveness is the ability for one negative event to infect a whole lot of other things. So to give you an example of what I mean, let's imagine you get dressed, ready for work. You go downstairs, have your breakfast, have a cup of coffee, and you're just finishing your breakfast when you knock the cup of coffee over and it spills onto your skirt or your dress or your suit or whatever it is you're wearing. And you're forced to rush upstairs to make a hasty change of clothes. But that makes you late. You don't leave the house at the normal time. The result of that, you get stuck in traffic. And you know the situation, you're in a hurry and every single red light is against you. So you arrive at school that little bit late, which means that there's a queue for the photocopier. So you get in the queue and guess what? By the time you get there, the photocopier jams and you can't do the photocopying you need. And that is the day ahead a write-off. One negative event seems to infect our outlook for the whole day, or sometimes even the week or month ahead. So P is also for pervasiveness. Also, personalization. Sometimes people who are pessimists will tend to take things personally. And in 23 years of school leadership, I dealt with some pretty negative situations. And I dealt with some quite difficult complaints from some parents. The vast majority of them were lovely, but there were a few that took up a great deal of my time. But looking back with the benefit of hindsight, I don't think now there were more than a handful of parents out of hundreds that I dealt with over the years that had a problem with me personally. It was because of the chair that I was sitting in. And if somebody else was sitting in that chair, they would probably have exactly the same conversations. So P is also for personalization. And finally, P is also for pyramid thinking. So pyramid thinking and pessimism tend to work hand in hand. And what I mean by that is if you've got a pessimistic member of staff who comes up with a problem that has to be overcome in order for them to do what you're asking of them, imagine that's the tip of the pyramid. Remove that problem, the tip of the pyramid, and they will then automatically come up with two more problems underneath. Remove those two, and they'll find another layer of reasons why things can't be done. So P is also for pyramid thinking. So what are the benefits of an optimistic outlook? Well, there are a number of them, both personally and for the school in which we live in. Firstly, in terms of our personal well-being, there's been quite a lot of research done by the Mayo Clinic, very respected clinic in America. And in their studies, they found that actually an optimistic outlook tends to increase our lifespan. It boosts our immune system, making us less susceptible to infections and diseases. It improves our cardiovascular system, and it generally improves our physical and mental well-being, which means that when life throws us a curveball, which it always does from time to time, we're in a better place to actually deal with it. So what are the benefits for school? Well, a number of things. Firstly, I think that optimistic leaders tend to bring an energy and enthusiasm to the role which attracts other people, which means that when we're recruiting for staff, we tend to attract the best quality candidates because most people want to work in an environment which is positive and forward-looking. So that's benefit number one. Benefit number two, optimistic leaders themselves tend to bounce back quicker when faced with a knockback. So in bouncing back quicker themselves, it means that the organization that they lead, in this case, school, is able to move forward from that setback more quickly. And thirdly, a bit like dogs become like their owners, I think ultimately schools become like their leaders. So if you've got a school leadership that is indecisive or fearful, that tends to permeate downwards. But equally, if you've got a school leadership team that are positive and optimistic in their approach, that also tends to permeate downwards, giving the staff a more of a can-do attitude. But it's a challenge at times, and it's been a tough year. And none of us are either completely an optimist or completely a pessimist. We tend to move between the two. And just like our emotions go up and down in a natural kind of a rhythm, so it is with optimism. It ebbs and flows. But there are things that we can do to actually increase or at least maintain our sense of optimism. An American psychologist called Albert Ellis came up with a theory of human behavior, which he referred to as ABC: adversity, belief, and consequence. So adversity might be, let's say we have a performance management review and we get some negative feedback. So that's the event. Belief, it knocks our confidence in our ability to do our job. And consequence, our confidence is not, so we experience a dip in mood. So that's the theory. But it was a while later that another psychologist called Martin Seligman came along and said, actually, we can learn to increase our optimism, but that relies on adding a D and an E. And D is for disputation, looking for other evidence which contradicts the negative perception that we may have of ourselves. So it could be, for example, looking back at other performance management reviews where you've had more positive feedback and reminding yourself of your ability to do the job. I used to keep a file of thank you cards and positive emails. Not that people were forever knocking on my door telling me what a brilliant job I was doing. They didn't, but they did from time to time. And they became a bit of a treasure trove for times when I felt my confidence and my optimism were taking a knock. So disputation, challenging the negative perception, gives us actually E. It increases our confidence and it gives us energization. We get more of a boost. We feel better about ourselves and feel more capable of doing the job that we're faced with. So, some tips then for how do we increase or at least maintain our personal level of confidence? Well, my suggestion number one is avoid the negs. By that, I mean those people with a negative outlook. Easier said than done, I know. And I know we're not meeting very much face to face at the moment, but I'm optimistic that there will come a time when we are again. And I used to find that if I went to head teachers meetings, I very quickly got to know as a new head who the negative people were. You know, the people, the serial moaners and whingers. And I made a point of not sitting near them because when I did, I kind of felt myself sucked into their sphere of influence. So within reason, and whilst avoiding, obviously, claims of favoritism and cronyism, try and surround yourself in school with the people with an optimistic outlook, because it will boost your own level of optimism as well. Tip number 2 is to remind yourself of your strengths and achievements. Now, boasting has a very negative connotation, and I can see why. Nobody likes smart aleck. But actually, sometimes reminding ourselves and doing a bit of internal boasting about what we have achieved is really quite helpful and quite important. So in the back of my diary, I keep a list of my professional accomplishments, some of the battles and some of the hurdles that I've overcome in my career and what I've achieved. When I take stock, actually, there's a lot that I am proud of. And doing that in times of doubt or when we feel our optimism being knocked can be really helpful. Of course, you don't have to share it with anybody else, but it gets rid of some of the negativity bias that we sometimes feel ourselves slipping into. Thirdly, I think it pays to be realistic and accept the fact that there are some things which we just are not going to be able to change. Read you a quote from a prayer, which, regardless of what your religious beliefs may or may not be, I think there's wisdom within the words. And it goes like this: God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. Because wasting our energy on things that are beyond our influence to control is terribly draining and can deplete our sense of optimism. Fourthly, find an alternative way of looking at things. Put another spin on things. So with a trusted colleague or friend, within any challenging situation, look for some of the benefits, the small silver linings. I don't know when this is all going to end, but I know that we're all changing the way that we do things. And I strongly suspect that things will not go back exactly to the way that they were. And I think there probably will be some things that we wouldn't want to change. For me, I think I'm aware that more people are talking about their mental well-being than pre-COVID. And I think that's an incredibly positive thing because it removes the stigma of talking about times when we actually struggle and enables us to show that vulnerability that we all have from time to time. So, fifthly, find ways of focusing on other things. It's easy to get into the position of focusing purely on work. And when we do that, we become quite internalized and it can become quite obsessive. Believe me, I know. So think about your friends, think about your family, try and maintain those interests, try and maintain those hobbies and projects. So being optimist is really important, but it needs to be tempered with realism. Nobody wants blind optimism in their leaders because blind optimism actually blinds us completely to some of the potential threats of our particular course of action. So I was coming back from Leicester to Derby a couple of weeks ago, and I'm aware that the journey is 30 miles because I've done it many times. But I looked at the petrol gauge as I set off, and the petrol gauge told me I'd only got 25 miles left in the tank. Now, everybody tells you, don't they, that there's more petrol in the tank than the gauge always says. So the optimist in me thought, I'm probably okay to get back. The realist in me thought there's a real risk here that if I'm wrong, then I could break down on the M1, which would not be a smart move. Guess what? I filled the tank. So be optimistic in yourself, but temper that with a realism. Now let's think about an optimistic staff room, either virtually or in actual physical terms? How do we keep our staff with an optimistic outlook in the current climate? 5 tips. Number 1, celebrate your successes. We're very good at celebrating what the children do, less so what we achieve as a staff. And it's easy, given the current situation, to get to the end of the week and think about all the things that have happened which have not been so positive. But actually, on a Friday morning, 10 minutes before the start of school, concentrate on the things that you have collectively overcome. And it means that people actually go into the weekend with a much more positive frame of mind. Number 2, know your staff. Know their strengths, know their areas of interest. You can't always do it, but the more you're able to align work to the interests and the strengths of members of staff, the more positive and the more optimistic they will feel. Number 3, let people in on things. Sounds obvious, but nobody likes to feel like an outsider, particularly if it's a topic or a situation that affects them personally. And in the absence of information, people tend to fill in the blanks themselves, usually incorrectly. So regular and honest communication is absolutely vital for maintaining staff optimism. Fourthly, show some flexibility. Most of your staff are probably parents themselves. And whilst nativities and sports days and face-to-face parents' evenings are on hold for now, they will come back. And the flexibility of allowing staff to attend those is worth its weight in gold in terms of currency and goodwill. And fifthly and finally, model the behaviour you want to see in your staff. So model work-life balance. If they see their senior leaders in school every hour God sends and emailing throughout the weekend, it gives off the subconscious message that that's what's expected of them. And it's not sustainable in the long run. So let them know that you go home early one night a week. Let them know what you're doing at the weekend and what you've got planned for the next holiday. And be careful with the whole staff emails. An effective way of getting information out quickly, but to my mind, you can never replace the value of an actual face-to-face conversation. Socially distanced, of course. So I want to finish off with a quick story, not mine, but it comes from a book called Little Owl's Book of Thinking. It's a book bought for me by a friend and colleague some years ago, and it really helped me. And it's the story of a father owl teaching his flightless owlet son lessons of life, just using the woodland around them. And in the final chapter, they come across this great fallen tree, a huge obstacle blocking the path. And the little owl can see no way round it or over it. And his father says to him, "There's always a way round it or over it. And even if there is not, that tree trunk will not be there forever. It will eventually rot away." And it will be like that with COVID. It may seem at the moment an immovable obstacle. And I can't tell you when it's all going to come to an end, but I know it will. And each and every day that you spend in school takes you one day closer to that resolution when it is removed and we can get back to some semblance of normality. So thank you for all your hard work, for all the things that you're doing in school at the moment to keep our schools running for our children. And take care of yourself. Thank you. Take care.